The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Answering Antinatalism. This video actually came about because of an email that I received from someone just this past week. But it's something that's been living in my head for quite a long time. As an atheist, I tend to deal pretty much 50-50 at this point between answering and addressing religious claims and objections to, secular morality or the existence of God and things like that, and then dealing with atheists who are wanting to address various philosophical concepts or social issues, and talking about the how and why we go through certain things. Like just today, somebody briefly joined the Atheist Community of Austin's Facebook page to basically say, why is there a community at all? It seems like a community demonstrates a weakness, like you can't do this on your own, and why would I need a community? And I quickly pointed out and replied back, basically you're posting, I'm going to come into your community in order to explain to you why I don't think I need community and why you shouldn't either. The post is self-refuting. You could not express that sentiment without coming into a community to do it. Because even those of us who are perhaps the most antisocial are still pretty much social creatures. I'm right, and I need somebody to know I'm right. I'm weak, and I need the help from someone who's weak, but I don't want to be belittled for being weak. There are lots of reasons for community. There are lots of reasons, not just because we are social creatures. There are real benefits to it outside of just general, ancestral psychology of we are the descendants of social creatures and such. There are truly beneficial things to our psyche. There's also people who are fine on their own, somewhat. I don't know how many people are truly fine on their own for long periods of time. The people who end up in a cabin in the woods for 20 years, I'm not sure that they're particularly stable. They may think that they're fine. But in the process of having these conversations, a lot of cool subjects come up, and some of them are philosophical exercises. I want to sit around and think about the big questions in life, like identity, what makes me me, or possession and property. Can I actually own anything? What does it mean? Some of these delve into political ideologies, libertarian views on this, or Republican or conservative views on this, democratic, progressive views on this, etc. There's a question about who and what we are that takes on a bunch of different forms. There's a legitimate concern, and I say legitimate seriously, that some people, after finding their way out of religion, will slip into nihilism. They will get to the point where they recognize that, as far as they can tell, the universe doesn't care about them at all. The universe has no intrinsic value or purpose for them, and this means that their life doesn't have any intrinsic value or meaning or purpose. And then they will extend this to, therefore, life doesn't have any value, meaning, or purpose. And I'll interject here to say, yes, it does. We're the ones that give it that. We are the value-creating machines. We care about things because we care about them, and that's what gives them value. It doesn't matter if the universe cares about human life. It doesn't matter if the universe has a meaning or purpose. It doesn't even matter if, in fact, there is a God who has a meaning and purpose for my life. My life has whatever meaning and purpose I give it from my perspective, and my life might also have meaning and purpose from somebody else's perspective. And certainly, I value other people's lives. There are people who value my life, etc. This takes on a couple of strange forms. One is the movement that's known as the voluntary human extinction movement. And essentially, they are advocating that humans are a terrible blight on the universe, and the best thing we can do is allow for humans to go extinct. And so they're going to argue for this, not necessarily by advocating for the mass suicide and intentional destruction of the human race, but by let's just stop breeding. There's an offshoot of this, which doesn't necessarily advocate for human extinction, but it's called the antinatalist movement. And essentially it is an argument that we should, for moral reasons, stop reproducing. And so a gentleman emailed the TV Atlas this week and said, I'm having a really difficult time going through the antinatalist argument from asymmetry. And could you look at this and address it and tell me what's wrong with it? And I almost said no. I mean, I got videos to do. I'm streaming stuff on Twitch on occasion. I'm heading up stuff at the ACA. It's also holiday season, Christmas, Saturnalia, solstice, New Year's, all that stuff. I'm not going to take time to dig through the antinatalist argument for asymmetry. But I was bored, and I had a couple minutes, and I went through it, and I realized it's actually, for me, and hopefully for some of you, an intriguing exercise in identifying fallacies in an argument. Because as I pointed out in another video that I did this month, it's actually rare that we get a proper syllogism. And I'm going to do this in a loose form of that syllogism. But the asymmetry argument for antinatalism essentially goes like this. Pain is bad. Pleasure is good. Then we expand upon that idea to say the absence of pain is a good thing. And it's a good thing even if there's nobody to experience this absence of pain. Because if there's an experiencer and there's the presence of pain, that would be bad. And so the absence of pain is a good. And at a minimum, the net pain goes to zero rather than massively harmful to a person, but goes to zero if there's nobody to experience it. So pain is bad, pleasure is good. The absence of pain is good even if there's nobody to experience it. The absence of pleasure is only bad if there is an experiencer. Essentially, if someone exists and they are experiencing an absence of pleasure, that would be bad. If nobody exists, then the absence of pleasure is back at a dead needle zero, the same as that. And so this asymmetry in the argument is what they use to say, this is why we morally should stop reproducing. Because if humans don't exist, then there's no bad from the experience, the active experience of pain, and there's at least a dead zero neutral of an absence of pleasure. That sounds cool. Okay, I'm convinced. I'm not going to reproduce. Actually, it's really easy for me because I'm 50 now. I haven't had any kids. I can't have kids without scientific health, and I have no plans to have kids. But I don't want anybody thinking that I'm doing so because I've been convinced by the antinatalist argument. So let's dig in. First of all, pain is bad. No. Bad and good are value judgments that require a judge. There must be an agent assessing those things to determine the bad and good evaluations. That's important to remember and keep that in the back of your mind. But the simple statement, pain is bad, is a problem. Because that's not true. What one person experiences as pain, someone else might also experience as pain, and yet their assessment of how bad it is, or if it's even bad, is a little more complicated. Pain is a warning system in the body to let you know about potential dangers, and it's what teaches us to learn. And so while the instant of pain that we experience may in fact be bad in that instance if we only focus on the pain we're experiencing, we don't get to overlook all the good that pain might be doing. Putting your hand over a hot stove without even actually touching it to the point where you start to feel pain lets you know that if you were to put it down there, you would experience terrible pain. It's a warning system. And the warning system, I would argue, if we're going to simplify things to pain bad, pleasure good, warning system good. And now you have pain as both bad and pain as the warning system, which must be good. So now we already have a conflict basically in their first premise. The same thing's true with pleasure, by the way. Pleasure can't be simplified to just good, pain bad, pleasure good, because there's lots of pleasure that feels good in the short term that ultimately has terrifying consequences afterwards. I have not actually been high on heroin, but I would imagine it feels good. That doesn't mean that using heroin to feel good is ultimately a good thing. We know about addiction. We know about the negative consequences of addiction. This applies to all kinds of drugs. There are some drugs that don't seem to have any addiction at all. You might, LSD, for example. Ooh, it's good. But that doesn't mean that just because it's not addictive, that there's not also a bad thing coming out of it. Maybe the problem with something like LSD is that we're wasting 14 hours. Maybe the problem with something like LSD is that we're having these trippy experiences, and we, as pattern recognition machines, are prone to injecting more hidden meaning into what we experience while we're tripping than we should. In the same way that we do it with sleep. Sleep, I would argue, could be viewed as a bad thing or a good thing. I haven't slept, I've had periods where I haven't slept much at all in the last couple of months. It annoys me. And yet I also actively despise the fact that I need sleep. I'd rather be doing something all the time. I'd rather be experiencing all the time. I'd rather not have that gap in consciousness that we can talk about, hey, how can I tell the difference between me waking up this morning and a clone of me waking up this morning? But we're not going down that route today. So it begins with pain bad, which isn't necessarily true and is a gross oversimplification. It then gets to pleasure is good, which isn't necessarily true and is also a gross oversimplification. We know of the psychology of this, that there are people who will actively hurt themselves or pretend to hurt themselves or undergo things that are painful because the ultimate consequences that they experience are pleasure. And I'm not just talking about simple things like, ooh, spank me, it's BDSM time, and that releases endorphins and it amplifies stuff. There's actual science behind all that. I'm talking about people with things like Munchausen's, where they will actively work to make themselves sick and suffer through that because of the comfort and attention that they get from people around them. The world is far too complicated to simplify it to pain bad, pleasure good. There are people, when we talk about who we are as human beings, including some friends of mine, who think that our primary motivation is not to seek pleasure, but it is to avoid pain. I disagree with them. I think that is also an oversimplification. And I would use the Munchausens as an example. Those people are clearly not avoiding pain. They are seeking pleasure and they're using pain to do it. And so maybe we're primarily about seeking pleasure. Maybe we are primarily about avoiding pain. Maybe neither of those are true. Maybe we're biasing the results by suggesting that it can be simplified to what we do. Because I would also argue that there are things that are neither painful nor pleasurable, and maybe that neutral area is what we're seeking. Although maybe that neutral area is boring as hell and we're seeking to get out of that neutral area. And maybe we're willing to go down the path of pain a little bit because sometimes pain is preferable to neutrality. Because if you are dull and bored, if you are suffering from some kind of clinical depression, then pain means you're feeling something rather than nothing, and feeling itself is something worth seeking. The point is not for me to make declarations about human psychology and whether we're pain seekers or pleasure seekers or pain avoiders or pleasure avoiders. It's that all of this is far too complicated to become as simplified as pain good, pleasure, or pleasure good, pain bad. The second part of the argument actually makes things worse, because the first premise there is that the absence of pain is a good thing even if there's no one to experience it. That's simply, obviously false. It is so false that they refute the very principle of this in the next premise. You have to have an experiencer to have any sort of good-bad judgment. Pain can't be simplified to bad, but it certainly can't be said to be, the absence of pain can't be said to be good if there's no experiencer, if the valuation of good and bad requires an experiencer. And their second premise proves this. The absence of pleasure is only bad if there is someone to experience it. And so somehow, when putting this argument together, the purveyors of this idea recognize that there needs to be an experimenter for there to be an evaluation that it's bad, but there doesn't need to be an experiencer to evaluate something as good. Well, that's bizarre. In order for there to be any sort of assessment, it's not like there's good, bad. There is a spectrum where things are increasingly bad and increasingly good, and you can't even really map that out because of the overlaps I talked about before. So, in order to make any sort of value judgment about whether or not an action is in fact pain or is in fact pleasure, and whether that pain is in fact bad and how bad, or good and how good would the absence of that pain be, there needs to be an observer. So the second premise of that second part fundamentally undermines the problem in the first part. And that's what's so frustrating about this antinatalist argument for me. It is refuted by itself that there must be an experiencer in order for something to be evaluated as good or bad, and yet the opposite isn't true just seems fundamentally bizarre and false on its face. If good and bad judgments are truly subjective, then there must be a mind, an agent that is evaluating these things. And by the way, we can't even simplify that, because what I think, how pleasurable I think something is, or how painful I think something is, could be fundamentally different from what somebody else experiences. And so it's like, if I have to go through a number of trials to get to this big reward at the end of the maze, there are people for whom even the first trial is going to be too much. They're just not equipped to handle that sort of difficulty, that sort of thing that they identify as pain. And yet there are also going to be people who, when they get to that first trial, are going to recognize, yeah, this in other circumstances would be viewed as painful, but I got my eye on the prize. And so making it through this painful hurdle to the next hurdle is actually immensely more valuable and pleasurable, such that this pain, because it produces this pleasure at the end of it, is worth it. We're not all the same. What our limits are going to be different. How we're going to evaluate things are going to be different. And the antinatalist argument basically boils down to, we can simplify everything down to a binary. Is it painful and is it pleasurable? And then we can somehow also say that the pleasure will never be enough to justify even a moment of pain. That's what would be required. The truth is, this sort of metric is already built into who we are. And it's something that we need to be focused on and addressing, and in some cases, treating. Because what I can handle in my life before I reach the point of giving up, where the pain is too great and the prospect of pleasure is so small that I am ready to end my life, is a serious question. And it faces all of us. We are starting to get to a point where we're properly going to be addressing as a community, I hope, end of life issues, death with dignity. There are people who, by seemingly any accessible standard, have no prospect of recovery, are painfully suffering, and for whom it may be the best thing for them to allow them to end their life with dignity. But at a minimum, we have to respect people's autonomy and individual freedom, because the denial of that may trump any other assessment of pleasure and pain. To make individuals a slave to an ideal, to a government, to a religion, to somebody else's opinion about their life, maybe that's the most harmful thing we can do. And so if you're an antinatalist, cool, don't reproduce. But if you're going to argue that there's some moral issue that should force the rest of us to not reproduce, I think A, you are oversimplifying things. Not just pain and pleasure, but you're oversimplifying who we are. B, you are oversimplifying and generalizing about what kind of predictions you can make about the future. Because how do you know that as we continue to grow and learn, that the next generation or the next generation or the next generation isn't going to actually come up with solutions to many of the things that we find incredibly painful today, such that the general pleasure in someone's life will always trump the pain in it. But we don't have to wait for those future generations, because as I said, that mechanism is already built in. The truth of the matter is that for most people, life is its own reward. That the pleasure and the good things that we experience already clearly and obviously trump the bad things that we experience. We understand going through trials and tribulations and sickness can actually make us stronger. It can actually get us the attention we need. Why? Because we're a community. Because we are learning. Because we know more than our ancestors did. And that this antinatalist argument, as flawed as it may be as an actual syllogism purportedly based on evidence, is just another window into nihilist teachings. something that has come about because religions have given people the notion that their life must have value and purpose and meaning coming from outside of them, and anything other than that might as well just end it all. It's got no value. The universe doesn't care. This existential dread that people experience is in many ways the result of religions lying to people about the nature of their existence. And if some movement, be it the voluntary human extinction movement, the antinatalist movement, or otherwise, is going to continue down that path of gross oversimplifications in such a way that it impacts people's desire to live and their desire to reproduce by overemphasizing pain and undervaluing pleasure and oversimplifying the dynamic between them, then yeah, it's relevant to the discussions that we have, because now it's about humanism and it's about skepticism. And while they may not be a religion, bad arguments that fundamentally may have the effect of miring people in depression, encouraging suicide, encouraging people to not have children because of a bad argument. Not that everybody should have children, but the arguments that do that, from my perspective, fundamentally just as harmful as any I've heard from any religion, and perhaps more harmful, because they're not appealing to some magical text or something else that we can disregard as, well, what's your authority? They're purporting to come from philosophy and science and sound reasoning, and they're not. And that's why I'm not an antinatalist. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.